This is a framework, which means on the basis of long clinical experience and research documenting aspects of this, we kind of can lay out now what seems to be a trajectory of change in individuals who are in what we would call a kind of recovery process. And the stage idea is not that there are any fixed stage with real boundaries. Now you're here, now you're here, as soon as you're here, you move to there. It's really a guideline. When we say a framework, it means here's some kind of clinical profile. And if you see enough of this profile, it gives you an idea about what the client may need to move them to further along. And it needs to be used in that, with that kind of caution. Well, everybody knows that the earliest stage, we're talking about early recovery. You notice I have denial as a stage of recovery. And the reason I have that is because, again, it's consistent with the message that I want the client to hear, that even though, in fact, you're actively using and, in a sense, not accepting your use and all of that, it doesn't mean that you're not changing. The issue there is that when you finally see a client, for whatever reason, something has already got them there. You know, I mean, even if in terms they're actively using and they're still saying some negative things, you have to make some assumption that you want to use in that client what might be their own propensity to change. And so you see denial as a stage which can be changed. And so that's a philosophical point. That's not a science point, but it's a philosophical point. And I think it's a better message to the client than simply say, when you're in denial, I walk out of the room, and it's case closed. So the issue is always looking at what's changing. But here's the first bullet you'll see on the slide is what I would call a working definition. Those were the short version that you saw on the blue slides. So this is the denial is simply defined as active abuse with no problem recognition or problem acceptance. So the first thing you're looking at, does this individual recognize that they have a problem, and do they accept that problem? So if you want to say somebody in denial, that's what you want to clarify. Now you can see that when you just leave it at that, it may not be enough. So if you really want to talk about denial, you begin to see, well, wait a minute, it's got to be more. It's more than that. There are levels of denial. So you may have, like that first level, does not acknowledge any use at all. You know, your mother said this, your wife said this, you know what I mean? I don't even use it at all. What are they talking about? It's their problem, it's not mine. That's a level, right? Now, why is that important right away? Because the issue is, if I know that, and I'm interested in helping this individual change, I'm working from that level. Just imagine throwing services at somebody at that level. Totally wasted. Okay, most of the people we see are maybe not at that level, so we'll see. Uses but little or no recognition of the drug problem. That is, yeah, I have a little use, but I don't really see it as a problem. That's a level. May acknowledge the extent of use, but does not accept that it's problem use. Yes, I use a fair amount, but I don't think it's a real problem for me. I can use. May accept the problem, but does not recognize, acknowledge, or accept an association between their drug use and other life problems. So what we're doing in this slide is like kind of walking up the ladder, you understand, in terms of the other way, the opposite direction, from high denial to lower denial. But only, and you can break each one of these down also if you want to go that far. But immediately this slide alone begins to convey the whole concept of recovery. In other words, what's the kind of standout characteristic of a client who's considered to be involved with in a drug problem? What are the characteristics that might stand out very quickly that you want to essentially assess with that client? May accept drug use and associated problems, but does not accept these as difficulties or issues that require any attention. You get people who say, yeah, I got a problem, and I think it's affected other people, and I believe it, but I don't want to do anything about it. Now, even this slide, which I think is a rather crude slide, breaks down a denial really into kind of these levels. But it makes this point in assessment right away, that how carefully you have to really hear where this client is and how they view themselves with respect to their drug use. That's going to bear upon what we can give them or do for them or how we can assist them. If we don't understand this, we can do all kinds of foolish things in ways you can sit in counseling. They may be sitting there to quiet the wife down or the husband down, or the judge, or to get their kids back. And you're working, and you don't know that, you know what I mean? And because they still have not gotten out of some level of denial, and you're still trying to somehow do things with them, but they're really there because you know, they're under some coercion. They've got another agenda. Now watch this. If you're talking about recovery, and you've gotten a little bit of drift of my conversation on this today, it's not only their addiction that's the problem, right? This slide is all about drug use, but it adds these phrases and other problems and related problems to imply to you and to the client there's other things that you have to recognize and accept about yourself. Not simply the fact that you have drug use problems. You know, the other things which you and I now will talk about. Well, you know, problems like dealing with responsibility, having a good moral code, being able to tolerate frustration, being able to deal with criticism, being able to deal with essentially setbacks in life. Certain values that you may have or not have. We now know, as we talk about whole person disorder, those may be other problems. You know, most of the people who go into drug treatment may finally admit they got drug problems. Yeah, I got drug problems. But they may not yet be ready to admit that they got these other problems. You know, having problems with me being able to, you know, tolerate frustration, deal with criticism, deal with setback, having social skills, being able to emotionally manage myself in any kind of mature way. They may not even see that. But we say, from a recovery point of view, what you should be saying, is that if those other kind of correlated problems are not recognized and addressed, you're still at risk. Because I know if they don't change, even if you temporarily stop your drug use, but those other problems keep going on, those are going to be risk factors, essentially, that'll bring you back to drug use. But that's a whole person view. And that's what I'm coming back. Recovery, in my view, and what the science indicates, it's got to be more like whole person. You can't simply be working on the fact that they use or don't use. Did you use today? Give me your urine. Yes, no. It's what other ways are you changing, which ensure the likelihood that now that these other correlated behaviors, attitudes, values, emotional management, all of that is changing enough so that it provides an immunity to the drug use. If I can handle criticism, if I can handle setback, if I can handle defeat, as examples, I'm less likely to use. They've been triggers. So when we talk about denial, we're not only talking about drug use. And that's why we get many people come into treatment looking like they're not in denial. They're saying, I got drug use and I got a drug use problem. They know they got a problem. I led to jail or led to losing money. They saw the outcomes of their drug use. But these others, which I'm not saying, I'm recommending that you actually talk to them about it yet. I just want you to know it. That denial really means, you know, may extend to all of the correlated problems that maybe are assessed or not assessed. And that shows you the mystery of this early assessment. The client comes in, willing to come to drug treatment, only to deal with the issue of drug use. We do some contingency contracting, may give them methadone, and some other, put them on some kind of schedule. They may stop their drug use. We didn't address the rest of the client. They think the rest of their other problems are housing and employment. I'm not talking about that. It's the definition is that they're okay. That's why, and as I mentioned earlier at the opening of the session, in therapeutic communities, they intuitively recognize that. The client can get clean in the program in the first 30 days. So according to them, that's it. My problem is solved. Case closed. I'm drug-free. A lot of the dropouts did believe that, in the first 30 or 45 days, first time in their lives they've ever been drug-free for 45 days. And would leave treatment, flight into hell. You know, they would say, oh, I'm okay. Never fully recognizing that, you know, there are other, in quotes, problems that they had to work on. And much of an intensive treatment that I talked about earlier has to be educated enough to know those are we got to assess those, and those are the problems that we have to work on in this treatment. That's why it's defined as intense. That is, you use a therapeutic community as an example of an intense treatment. It's designed, and this is not a training in this, but the whole approach, the therapeutic community method, community as method, is defined to address those characteristics. Not the drug use. The drug use is over already after 30 days. We're now addressing how you think, the attitudes you have, how you handle your emotions, how you interact with other people. That's what the whole program does. It's designed to address that. That's the idea of changing lifestyles and identities. So an intense treatment program has got to say, you know, I've got a client where many things have to change in this client. That means in any sophisticated system, we should be assessing that routinely. What are the other characteristics that need to be essentially assessed and identified in any assessment to help you finally define, well, is this a severe client? Severity in that is not only their drug use. They may be chronic liars, chronic manipulators. They may be individuals who have exploited men and women sexually. You don't get to that, you're not going to get any long-term recovery in this individual. Well, it requires a system that's now sophisticated enough to say, well, we know something about this disorder. We should assess this like, well, maybe it isn't there. Maybe we can check this out and say no. Like no other evidence of anything. Not likely, but are you with me on this? Or, okay, just checking, beginning to look like a painting. That I was worried. So that's the denial stage, but you know, and of course I'm only highlighting, again, we're not in the training, but this is a teaching. I want to highlight the importance of the kind of the details. If you follow now an individual moving from denial, a good way to describe them is they get to an ambivalent stage. That is, something's changed. They have recognition. They can talk about problems now. So we're not battling whether they see problems. The trouble is it's very inconsistent. On Monday they got a problem, but on Tuesday everything's okay. So the ambivalence really comes a lot from, it's reflected in their inconsistent acceptance of the consequences of continued use and stuff. They may talk good on a certain day, but they really haven't settled it for themselves. And it'll be in and out. Now, it's a movement, so when I know I've got clients like that, very ambivalent clients, ambivalent about my drug, my problem, ambivalent about my problem. I accepted it yesterday, but today, maybe I don't have it today. Or I go into a program, I see other people who got severe drug use and sitting there in groups and really doing things. I'm not like that addict. That's not me. So one way the ambivalence will show itself is in terms of their contrast with other addicts. You know what I mean? Like the street addict is very different from the cocaine addict who works on Wall Street. You got Wall Street, then you got the street, Main Street. So we're two different addicts. They don't see, of course, what might be what's the same about it. That's another way of being ambivalent. So maybe I don't have that problem. That's not my problem. You know what I mean? I'm not as bad as that, or so on. It's a variation on the ambivalence issue. You need to know it because you say, what do we do about that? How much service do we give to that individual? What do we want to change in the individual? Do we want to reinforce their view of their own drug use, which is, yeah, I got a drug problem, but it's not like other people's problem. We want to reinforce that? Or do we want to essentially help them see it is like all addiction? You know what I mean? Diabetes is diabetes is diabetes. It's a terrific stage and a very challenging one. You get in some adolescents, for example, post-adolescents who've been long chronic pot users, they're frequently and totally if they're not in denial, they're in chronic ambivalence. Individual recognizes, this is now we're spelling it out a little bit now. So if you're going to lay it out clinically now, know what to look for and begin to see what you want to assess. Recognize transient or episodic problem does not describe these in terms of misuse, excess, abuse, dependency, or addiction. They may talk about their problem, but they tend to stay away from the extreme words around them. They don't identify with other substance abusers, which is one of the points I just made. Often believe that functioning with drugs is beneficial to the mood or their performance. Individual is not convinced of the value of change relative to the effort to change. If you ask your caseload, whichever that caseload is and wherever you're working, do you understand this individual in terms of, let's say, this stage? Have you investigated this stage? That's a question for the, it's kind of a silent question. You don't have to vote. But I'm willing to hear it, whatever you say to me. You get to a third stage. Extrinsic. This is the word motivation, folks, means to move in the Latin sense, in terms of its Latin root. Extrinsic means outside forces move you. Outside forces move you. So the word extrinsic motivation. He got to this treatment program. Why? Because he's been pushed there by something. These folks often have some recognition and acceptance of drug use and associated problems, although I can tell you that this has gotten so deteriorated in terms of a system erosion effect that in prisons, where prisons have now gotten enlightened and say they want to provide drug treatment in the prison system for whatever reasons they have for the moment, they now have mandated, right, by law, people to go into treatment and essentially push them. And then when you finally talk to 30% of them, they're in denial around their problem. And half of those 30% will be correct. Because I've now found, to our great dismay, and I've got a lot of experience now in the U.S. penitentiary system, where I do a lot of work now on this, those clients will come in. Watch this. You want to hear a real delicate one? I am not an addict. I'm here because I'm a drug dealer. So I don't accept the fact that I got a drug problem, or much less be ambivalent about it. I don't accept it. Now, the problem there was that, but the system somehow, a couple of things happened. The system wanted to get because the drug dealing, it's drugs. So you were busted on, your crime was a drug crime, so you must be an addict, so we're going to send you over. So they've got their reasons to send the client without necessarily really clarifying whether the client actually sees themselves as having a drug problem. Now, the issue is serious because good programs can tolerate deniers. If I got 100 guys in a treatment program, it can tolerate 10 to 20 of them who don't want to do anything and they're in denial. The program can go on, the other people can continue their recovery. But if that ratio gets higher, where you got a program now that you got 100 people and 50% of them don't think they have a problem and should be here, but they're here under some form of coercion, the whole program suffers from that. So it's got very serious implications, this issue of understanding where they are, let's say in denial and ambivalence, this early stage, and how they got to treatment. You got people coming to treatment now. The question is, why are you here? So extrinsic motivation, the court sent me, my family sent me, my health sent me. That sounds, oh, that's a good thing. If they've got something's happening now, they've got, maybe there's a Hep C issue here, maybe they're coming. You would sound like that's at least a better reason, but believe it or not, it's a strange kind of coercive reason. Because what you want is the individual to see in the end, the next stage, we'll get to that in a minute, you really want them to see that they really believe they have a problem. not simply that their problem, their drug use has led to Hep C. There's this very fine-grained distinction here. You've got people who are users who will essentially accept that they've seen health consequences to their use, but they really haven't fully accepted the problem that they have. As you know where you see this most? In you. Smokers. Fully acknowledge that there are serious health problems to my smoking, but fundamentally haven't gotten deeply personally frightened about their smoking. Some level they're in denial. Intellectually accept everything about it, you know, yeah, I know it. But somehow it didn't get to me like it gets to some street addicts, you understand, who finally, in quotes, hit some bottoms, where they come out, and you'll see it in these later stages, and I'll repeat it then, I simply don't want to go back to where I was. You know now, he's no longer talking about police and anything like that. He's talking about, I just don't want to go back to where it was. It can't be that way anymore. The smokers don't get that yet. Many of us smokers. And I'm worried about the 20% who are smoking. Here's an example of these externally pushed people, the profile as we lay it out. They admit or accept drug problems, but only episodically, during periods of stress and under external pressure. That's a good, very, very good sign. Apparently motivated person, right? But when are they doing that? Usually when the fire is lit, you understand that? It's something, and things are broken down, you understand? Then they'll, yes, I see everything I got, and they may even cry and show a lot of things. But the moment they start to feel better, or there is relief, there's a difference between help and relief. The moment they feel relief, the problem's not that bad. They do not perceive, acknowledge, or fully accept their own, this is the one, contribution to their drug use, which really means those other characteristics I was talking about, or to their drug-related life problems, but attribute these, this is a big part of it, to external circumstances not in their control. This is a variation on the externally motivated client. The attribution of their problem to outside forces, as literal as the police and jury, court sent me, or watch this, my background. My drug problem is because of my background. One would think, hey, that's a pretty good beginning, you know, to bring about change. But you have to be very careful about what this individual is really saying to themselves. If they are still not saying, I'm the problem, but they're saying, this problem was essentially imposed on me by somebody else. Not that they don't have catastrophic stories to tell, not that it isn't true that they're going to have to, in their full recovery at some point, revisit the issue of their history and what the history has contributed to their behaviors. But that's different than saying that the addiction life and the lifestyle in the end was my choice.
Sometimes we feed into that as well.
Sure.
Professionals.
We do. In many different ways, and it's a good statement. But you see, begin to see how exquisitely subtle this becomes when you talk about the addictive disorder and the many thousands of people that we see at different places in this disorder, and then talk about, well, we want a drug treatment system to deal with all of this. This is, of course, what I'm hoping is the impact on you, that you begin to appreciate it with a kind of humility. They display fears and worries concerning legal, fiscal, health, family, social, domestic, employment problems. They were always worried about that. That wasn't chase them into treatment. But the question there is, okay, they're there, that's true, they're very common in the life of an addict. But the issue is, when there's some relief from those problems, what will happen to this client? This is one of the reasons the addictive disorder has its own repetitive cycle. It's all largely based on relief. I'm uncomfortable. If I get something that essentially reduces my discomfort, then I'm okay. Even down to the drug use itself, right? If I take drugs, and then if I stop taking drugs, I'm not comfortable, so I keep taking drugs. So that's our understanding of detox and withdrawal and so on, and the cycle there. but it all has to do with the rest of their lives and a variety of discomforts. If I'm too bored, I may take drugs. If I'm understimulated, I may take drugs. If I want to have sex, I may take drugs. Or if I don't want to have sex, I may take drugs. That's all relief. Go to a counselor. Get support. I feel better. Take drugs. Relief and help. Two profound comments, or really concepts, that needs to drive every system. We need to understand does our service, treatment and social services primarily relieve the client or help the client? I'm going to come back to that. If you're interested, of course, I got writings on this, and I hope you'll be stimulated enough to read. But these two concepts are very powerful in addiction and recovery. And that is, individuals who are continually getting relieved are at greater risk to continue their use. But that relief can come in very disguised ways, paradoxically through treatment. You can get counselors who are inadvertently relieving people by what we think is support. Doesn't mean there isn't a place for support. We'll come back to that. I don't want to get too radical on this. But I want you to be sensitized to the fact that, wait a minute, if I understand now a difference between relief and support, that addiction has its own continuity because individuals who get rapid relief from the discomforts and consequences of their life don't get a chance to feel the impact of those consequences on their life enough to get them into some stage of change. So in a way, we've got to let that maybe happen to some people. Certainly not relieve it, even if we don't push them that way. We're certainly not going to relieve it. So when early clients walk into treatment and start talking about all the people that they've hurt and so on, and presumably this is supposed to affect them now, the consequences of my drug use has affected my kids, my family, and so on, I want them to feel that. Not because I'm in any authority around this, but because I understand something about recovery. If this individual gets, we pinch his cheek too fast and take it easy and give him support and relieve that too fast or too injudiciously, I may be inadvertently reinforcing that in an outpatient setting. If I've got, on the other hand, 10 peers sitting around, and the 10 peers are likely to handle that much better than a single counselor. Because they will take that individual through these levels very quickly. Get the drift of this? Okay, I realize that it is a drift and it's not a full story. But typically, attempts to change involve reductions in use or complete but temporary detoxification. These people may have attempted to stop because the drug use got them into a very painful state of life. So they even recognize momentarily they got to stop because they're now in total pain and for a variety of reasons. But it'll be a temporary detoxification that occurs. And we know that by the relapse rates from detox clinics run around 80 to 92%. This is the state that everybody wants people to be in when they come into your treatment program. When they are, in quotes, seeking services, and when they are referred to services. So they accept their drug use and other problems. My life's been screwed up, it's been me, I know I got issues. And they have an expressed desire to change based on positive and negative inner reasons. Inner reasons. The word here, the operative word here is inner. Well, we'll see this in a moment. I wouldn't invent them for you. I think we should have some of them up on the slide. You notice the word intrinsic motivation, from within, versus extrinsic, from without. Influences that move us. Positive reasons are expressed in terms of self-efficacy. That means possibilities and desires for a new lifestyle, to attain good things, for personal growth, better social family relations. They want the good things in life. Those are positive reasons. And the self-efficacy idea is that somehow engaging in the behavior and activities to make those things happen. I want them. So they're very good. Those are good reasons. You know, I've been sick. I've been crazy all these years. Now I want the good things in life. That's a sign of intrinsic motivation. In your assessing clients, you really have to spell out with them what they really want in life, which is different. I'm not talking about service, but what they want in life. What do they consider valuable to themselves? That's an efficacy notion. It's a measure of motivation. Negative perceptions are expressed in more self-deprecating terms. Self-efficacy for positive, self-deprecating for negative. Such as desires to abate or eliminate feelings of guilt. That's an inner, I call it a negative reason because it's a painful reason for the client. And I want to get rid of this feeling. Self-hatred, personal despair based on their hurting and failing themselves or others. That's a kind of general concept. This is the painful side of motivation, right? A force, a painful force that could move me, motivate. So when doing the assessment in clients, I can tell you something. If you just ran motivational assessment, not motivational enhancement, motivational assessment groups, or service, I don't like the word services, I'm going to come back to that, but groups which were designed to help people fully somehow express their motivational level as you now are coming to understand it. Like the kinds of things that should be said that should ring bells about motivation. That is, the changeability of this client. Often both are the same, they co-occur, and although motivated individuals identify external factors in their problems, they may be sent by the courts or pushed by the family, but still be intrinsically motivated. So we got a group that may be only externally motivated, then we have a group that's externally and intrinsically motivated, which very, very frequently is the combined effects of external and intrinsic motivation, which is a favorable predictor. When we measure in inmates who are in treatment in prison or drug courts where they've been referred by the court, the right way to assess those clients is, well, we know they're here primarily because the judge sent them here. That looks like external motivation. But you finally get into it, you say, hey, you know what? Some number of these people are also intrinsically motivated. A lot of graduates will tell you that in PCs. They got here first because of the courts. I wouldn't have gotten the treatment if the court didn't push me in here. But very quickly, if they didn't see it on day 1, on day 31, they began to reveal their inner motivation. There are things I want to change about myself. It's not really day 1. Usually, around the 4 to 6 months, a totally externally mandated client, one of the real challenges of treatment, which is something I don't want to jump the gun now for the moment, but in any good treatment system and any good treatment in general, is always working on internal motivation. They're always working on that. The treatment should devote most of its energy on helping individuals essentially identify reasons for change. And feel those reasons. That's why if we could run those groups, you can actually have a service, which I believe in, which is only dedicated to 2 stages of the recovery process, motivation and readiness. We're going to talk about readiness in a minute. But 2 stages. You can do more for the field by just working on that. If you truly understood these phrases, these stages of recovery, and worked out, I didn't give you the technology for how to do that yet, but if you fully understood this, you'd realize the potential big payoff for the field. If we devoted a lot of time with people coming in various levels of motivation and readiness, and were able to assess where they were, we could then do a great deal in terms of how to move them to the next stage. But if you're trying to get them in and do other kinds of treatment, as if you're trying to essentially induce some later stage of recovery, and they also could buy into that, let me get prepared for housing, let me get employment, let me reconnect with my family, without necessarily going through this real process of motivation and readiness to change themselves, which is, I argue, is the real bang for the buck in the system now. I'm going to come back to that, and because as you can hear, I'm kind of excited about it. Let's look at the next stage. So motivation, of course, is really kind of the beginning of a Cadillac stage, right? We've got clients who are now really invested in the change. They're saying, I've got problems, I accept the problems, I can even enunciate the reasons, I can express the pain around it. Still not enough, but it's necessary. Not all people come to treatment at that stage. The system has to recognize that. That's why we've got to go back and re-examine the system and saying, well, wait a minute, we better know how many people have really got here, and then decide where they belong and what they should get. A later stage, right? I'm motivated and I'm willing to change. And they may even then, as you'll see now, in this slide, what does this stage look like? Well, these are motivated people, intrinsically. And they've accepted even, but they may not have actually accepted the necessity for treatment. It's another one of those challenging stages. Here's an individual who is ready to do things to change. You know, they're motivated, got the pains, got the payoffs in their lives, and now, essentially, you think, okay, now let's just give them treatment. But they're not ready for treatment. They don't want to do treatment. Usually, if you look at their history, you see this. They view their drug problem as acute and primal within the context of other problems. That's good. They see that. They make serious attempts at cessation beyond simply detoxification. Not only have a detox history, but they've done other things. Use various forms, mainly various forms of self-management, or other, mainly, and non-treatment alternatives such as changes in geography, religion, jobs, relationships. All I got to do is get a job, change relationships, change where I live, and so on. And even at times, superficial entries into other treatments. This is a very challenging client because they really look like, well, that's it. They're motivated, they're ready, you know what I mean? They look like a good bet for the system to do something. But without really understanding this stage and the attempts that they have made and why they made those attempts and why those attempts didn't turn out as successfully as they liked. This is one of the most important clinical interviews you can engage in with a client. Incidentally, these slides should transform the level of clinical interviewing and clinical assessment if you really bought into this. Because what you really want to know here is, well, wait a minute, here's a guy, a man or woman says they're here because they want to change and they think they're ready to change. But now when I look at them and I see what treatments that they've gone into, if they did previous treatments, some of them did. What else they've tried, what'd you do to try to change, you know? You need to know that to give you an educated basis for saying, is this an individual, then you've got to look at the seriousness of their history, this is the severity issue, what the severity profile look like, and then say, this person is likely to do best in here or here. We'll come back to that. Although this stage of readiness is action-oriented, the client wants to do something about it. What it is an action stage. In the behavior, in the stages of change model, pre-contemplation, contemplation, action, and so on. That's not this model, that's something else. But there's some congruence of this. This willingness stage looks like the kind of action-oriented stage, but this is in much greater clinical detail than in the recovery process that is described in the stages of change. We're talking about recovery stages, not stages of change. Although it's action-oriented, it is not specifically directed to treatment. The reason I got this on here is when, in the early days in therapeutic communities, I would sit in the admissions. Phoenix House in New York was a big program. And they would have, 100 admissions a month. 100 admissions a month. And so we would be sitting downstairs talking with the admissions and trying to evaluate motivation. Of course, I even developed a scale which is available to you for both of these stages, which is motivation and readiness, which seems to be a very good working scale. Got it around for 30 years. But I got it out of the admissions office, just sitting with the admissions director and saying, let me talk to these clients coming through. So I did this as essentially a clinical exercise in the beginning. Let's talk to them. We know that they're filling out their admission papers and so on. Let's really talk to them. Let me just see where they really are in this. We were interested in the issue of dropout. That was the problem. I was trying to learn ways in which we can control or modify dropout rates. And so the issue here was then I discovered that most of the clients were motivated. That is, by meeting the criteria of the previous slide, they look motivated. So if they're motivated, why are we still getting 40 and 50% dropout rates, you understand, out down the road? It must be more than motivation that we need to look at. That's how I got to this stage. I started to ask different questions of the client. Something like this. Well, okay, you seem to be, you want to come in here. Let me tell you what this treatment program is like. I'm going to give you this advice too, but this was an early strategy. It happened to be a long-term TC. Well, you're going to come in here. You're going to sleep with 5 other people. The plaster's falling off the walls. The food stinks. People are going to maybe yell at you. You're going to have to do jobs. You're going to have to talk in groups and reveal who you are. You'll be talking to other people like yourself who have been further along in this program. You can't. We advise you not to talk to your family for the first couple of weeks while you're here because you got to get. I would simply run down the program, format to him as a way of informing him or her. Then ask the question, what do you want to do? Well, let me think it over. So that told me already, that this person, it may not be ready, for treatment, because if treatment sounds too hard, I'm not going to do it. And you've had people in the field that heard about places that sound hard, and they don't do it. Mark Johnson was telling me the other day, in early in his career, he heard about some TCs and he didn't want to do them. They looked too hard. So we go to the next stage. So that's readiness to change. And so that's a good candidate, but still not may be ready for treatment, particularly if it's going to be, if he needs an intense treatment, he may not be ready to do that. So you get to this stage, which is where they reject all other options. It's another readiness stage. You notice it's readiness for treatment. This is readiness for treatment. Previous slide is readiness to change. This is readiness for treatment. That means the client shows all of the previous slide, but they're now rejected all other options. And I'm going to tell you how I got to this stage and why I thought it was very important. They are ready. They've rejected everything else. They perceive treatment as their only alternative. Usually intrinsic motivation and unsuccessful past attempts at self-change are the dominant influence in their seeking treatment. Why you got to get that in your clinical interview? How many times you've done what? They accept their drug use and related problems as destructive to self and others, and notably they accept other attempts at change are insufficient to do the work. A key marker of the stage is that they recognize the need to change. Watch it now, this is the big one. I need to change myself, not only their chemical dependency. If you take them far enough along in that interview, it is, I've got to change, not simply my drug addiction. And they assert, and this last line comes right out of their mouths, whatever they have to do. I used to ask them finally that same question, now that you know about what we do here, what do you want to do? And the clients who were ready for treatment would say, whatever it takes. These two stages, or really three if you like, motivation and the two readiness stages, are profoundly important in your assessment capability, your clinical skills, not simply using a checklist, although a checklist will help you at least to train yourselves to do this. But it's going to be clinical skills. Usually, you really want to do it right and get the real information on this, it's going to be peers that will do it, and not some intake officer or counselor. Your best data will come from essentially trained and educated peers. They will get the information that we need about these two stages. Let's see, we still have a little bit of time, so. I'm going to move through these next stages. This is now middle recovery. I'm going to move through these in a more abstract way, because I really feel that my bias is on those first 5 stages, because the first 6 stages, because frankly, in my estimate around the world and everywhere, there are very few, although this stage is a very important stage, and I will talk about it, but beyond this stage, we see less and less of there are less and less clients in these later stages. And so, and that's one of the reasons I'm front loading it on this, because if the system begins to get sensitized to these first 6 stages, it'll make great advances, I think, in terms of fidelity and what it's delivering. The addiction is, let's say, if you follow the individual past the readiness, they get into a treatment, but even if they don't, if we're looking at an individual now who's essentially now undergoing the real stage of de-addiction, detoxing, for example, it's really not only pharmacological detox, it's behavioral and social detoxification. They not only have to stop the drugs they're using, they got to stop the people they're with, they got to stop the thinking that's been their problem. And so they're invested in doing that. It's a full that's why I call it a de-addiction stage and not a detoxification stage, because it's a multiple detoxification, physical and social and psychological. Ceasing the ingestion, ceasing drug-related thinking, and separating from the drug-related people and situations. You can see right away for the serious addict, in order to get to this stage, it's very unwise to have them on the street. For the serious addict, you want them at least let the odds be favorable to them that they can go through this de-addiction, not detoxification, de-addiction. And you can see the wisdom is that this is really a severe addict. I want to give them a shot at the de-addiction stage, and the best shot is probably get them away from the street. So when we say put someone in rehab, forget that phrase anymore. It's an uncomfortable and gross phrase. Put them in rehab. Understand this stage. If I understand what this client is and what they now need, I want to put them in a situation where at least they can accomplish this. And if I have them still on the street in either day treatments or outpatient settings, we're at high risk on this. The whole process becomes much more loaded with risk. So, you get into this stage this is a very powerful stage in our field to understand. Because this is now the individual who's now working in the recovery process. It's stage 6 at actually getting through the whole problem of being a drug user. This is really the first real challenge that they face, which is I'm going to stop. And a lot of things have to stop. I got to change the drug use, I got to change the thinking. And this is typically what we see individuals when they really undergo the de-addiction stage and not simply get a quick physical detoxification and then 3 days or 5 days later get out. Psychological and psychophysiological experiences of new and altered states such as craving, drug thoughts, attitudes, all of that thinking and feelings have to be, that have been suppressed or distorted by chronic drug use. This is a big thing. When people are getting off drugs, one of the big things that happens to them is that there are a whole new set of psychophysiological experiences that they get, in addition to craving and drug thoughts and attitudes. Feelings and emotions that start to emerge in them, that they were all being either in sedative or suppressed under their drug use. If you don't follow them through this phase of the de-addiction, where this is all going to start coming out, they're at total risk for reuse. Tolerance levels fluctuates for all discomforts, mood swings, shifts from exuberance to depression, hope, despair, belief to disbelief in the recovery course, craving and indifference, receptivity, rejection of treatment, all kinds of contradictory stages of effects you begin seeing. You will see it certainly in residential treatment in the severe addict, because at least you've gotten them off the street and now we're with them day by day, and you'll see them go through this, where a lot of this was discovered. You see them go through this change. But if they're in outpatient setting, they may be going through these changes and you have no handle on this. They all look like they're detoxing and de-addicting, but they're going through what I call the turbulent stage. And the issue there is you've got to be able to recognize it because of this very serious next statement on this slide. Which is to view this stage as de-addiction is an active trial and error stage of learning abstinence. They're learning abstinence. It's marked by the reappearance of thinking and perceptions and feelings of earlier stages. This actually can lead to intermittent reuse of the primary drug or another drug. So the de-addiction stage is a high turbulent stage which may essentially include reuse of other drugs. I'm talking about all non-residential settings where they may not have the opportunity to use it. But if they're in outpatient or in day treatment centers like this, where the opportunity is there, they may actually be making movements, but they also might reuse drugs. Because it is a stage, in my view, which is best understood as a trial and error process. For the restrictive TCs, like prison or TCs, the process of learning abstinence can lead to premature dropout in order to use drugs. We think that once they get past the first 15, 20 days in a TC, they're actually entering de-addiction, and because it's so uncomfortable, they drop out. And the old TC was not very wise about that. They just saw it as resistance. Or they may simply say the individual's not ready, which is not necessarily the truth. The case was that it was a very difficult, turbulent time for them, not simply in terms of the drug use, that they want the drug, but the stirring of other kinds of feelings and cognitions that were too difficult to manage. In less restrictive settings, I'm going to talk about this in a moment. In less restrictive settings such as ambulatory treatment, active use may continue while in treatment, although at a declining frequency. I'm now assuming a very sophisticated outpatient setting that understands how to manage the outpatient client if they are in the de-addiction stage. If you open the story with the client about abstinence in outpatient settings, then you got to shift your goal, because you want to get the individual essentially to, if they're going to achieve abstinence, you have to anticipate that they may have to go through this stage. And if you don't manage this stage very well and see it as a backwards going, moving, a regression of some sort, it's a mistake. Well, that's a clinical training issue, but just raises the point on this slide. For those leaving a restrictive setting, like a prison, delayed de-addiction may occur. They've been a year in prison, no drugs, no kinds of detoxification problems, no dealing with withdrawal from the social and psychological aspects of their lives that relate to that. They get out of prison, it's like having a de-addiction stage again. Because they have never actually undergone the process that they have to go through in de-addiction, which is literally to be faced with all of the, if you like, the triggers and circumstances that relate to their addiction, and then see how they deal with it. And in the de-addiction stage, a lot of prisoners leaving prison treatment, you might see relapse in the first 3 months. One reason is, of course, that they had no real training in an incremental way about how to deal with each of these impacts. We try to do it with relapse prevention training cognitively. It's effective, but minimally effective. You need other kinds of important interventions to allow a gradual incremental training of the client in the real world so that they can essentially not be essentially undermined completely by this, what I call secondary de-addiction. And then if it occurs, as it might very well occur, you have to recognize it as a secondary de-addiction. That's why I got to teach the parole officers and the probation officers how to deal with that, so you don't bust the client back into prison. This client essentially may be still in recovery, moving, but they're now in a certain stage of recovery, and if we mishandle that, we send them all the way back. The reuse of drugs in the de-addiction stage is better understood as, and here's the key phrase, the acquisition of abstinence. What's going on in this phase is the individual's struggle to become abstinent. You notice that abstinence is a late stage, if you're really serious about this. Stabilized drug freedom for a continuous period, usually beyond the individual's longest period of drug freedom. And here are some of the highlights of this. A shift, they're over the turbulence. That's the big thing. They're no longer actively turbulent anymore. when you want to talk about abstinence, remember, all abstinence means is refrain. That's what the word means, refrain. An individual could be refraining, like in the addiction stage, and be undergoing a lot of turbulence that would increase the likelihood that they may even reuse. But even if they don't reuse, they're going through all of that turbulence. Abstinence, the sign of abstinence is not only that you've refrained, but we don't see the turbulence anymore. That's why it's a late stage in recovery. A lot of people say we want to achieve abstinence. You want to look at not only are you not using drugs, but what else has happened to you. So it says here they're not actively coping with the direct and immediate threats to sustaining abstinence. This is where they're focusing on there. The idea is now the shift is from managing the de-addiction turbulence, which is the previous stage, to actually acquiring abstinence. That is what they do from acquiring abstinence to try to move toward maintaining abstinence. That usually means dealing with the direct and immediate threats that sustain the abstinence. So if anything's threatening the abstinence, they're coping with that, but they're no longer in the turbulent stage around that. That is, they've settled with this now to begin to recognize what it is they've got to essentially cope with so that their refraining can be sustained. Recognition of the external cues. This is the classic relapse prevention training in this way. Learning the behaviors and thinking to resist these primarily through, here's the three main coping mechanisms in abstinence, when you're simply in the abstinence state. Do you avoid effectively? Do you use distraction, cognitive distraction, effectively? Do you seek support effectively? Individuals who are in the abstinence stage are not only refraining, they have learned these skills. I know who to call, I know when to call. I know how to think if I start to get drug-related thinking or stupid thoughts. I know what to do about that. And I know essentially how to avoid dangerous places and dangerous situations. Although individuals are focused on self-control in relation to their cues, they begin, it's the phase where they also now begin in more assiduously self-examination. That is the other issues of their lives. You notice, though, that I have it as stage 8. It's fairly late. The individual has to go through what we just, the other 7, if you like, in some sense, to begin to say, did they really go through all of that? And when they finally get here, the abstinence begins to really count. Socially, they develop some attachment to the drug-free recovery network. We have many examples of that. And beginning to mend ruptures in relationships and other areas of their life in the abstinence stages. I know we have just a few minutes, and I just want to give you a touch of these last 2 stages. You won't see them very much. Continuance. The word shift is sobriety because now the individual has a new cognitive way of looking at their problem. The personal resolve to acquire and maintain behaviors and attitudes of right living. And here are some of the details of that. But you see they're in checks. But one of the things I really want you to see, there's a deeper recognition of the personal and life history contributions or contributors to their drug use behavior. They begin to really recognize this is when you begin to recover the history of the individual in the proper way. What it is about now, who they have been, what their life has been, they can look at all of that now in a way that's constructive. That is, this is a very serious issue. I'm sorry we don't have this much time, but the clinical issue here is, when do individuals get effectively and constructively get into their history, which we know is a very, very important aspect of their recovery. When do you get into that? And you can see as you're looking through these other phases, those other stages, you don't see that history. You're dealing in the here and now in terms of the individual. You now have a stable period of abstinence, stage 8, and now the individual has shown that stable period of abstinence, and they no longer have to be struggling. As you can see, the focus is on coping both with the external, circumstance, situational, and internal stresses, the emotional, cognitive states that lead to reuse. Could I get anxious? Do I have difficulties in things like my interactions with a spouse, my difficulties at work, how they in fact are beginning to affect how I deal with my abstinence, identification of the situations that relate, and then the modifications of the characteristic faulty reactions. All the what I call the other problems of the client's disorder. This is the stage that they're looking heavily at this. They're no longer, as you'll see in this next slide, and it's a good marker they're addressing those goals. I want to get down to this. The drugs are no longer seen as, I'm going down to the bottom two for the moment, just because of the time. But drugs are no longer seen as an option for coping with problems or experience in life. Instead, drugs are viewed as ineffective in providing relief, satisfaction, or escape, and drug use is seen as producing a worsening state. You know, in previous states, there's still some kind of a sedative relief effect of drugs in any one of those previous states. When you get to this state, the client somehow is telling you, they might have even tried it, they might even have had a reuse of drugs along the way. And what they'll tell you is that it didn't work for them. And that's a mark of the continuing stage. That in effect, the use of the drug no longer has the impact on the client that it once had. Drug-related thinking is, and like getting high, cynicism, rejection, and is infrequent, you know, or not at all, and does not compete with sobriety thinking, which is like dealing with reality in itself. So this is one of those. It's a late stage recovery, but not the latest one. The strongest one. This is the two major points. The second marker is the change process itself. Now, put this one in the bank. The individual acknowledges that the change process itself is a constant struggle, is a constant struggle, and accepts this fact with enthusiasm, confidence, and humility. What I'm getting at here is they are deeply invested in changing now. It's no longer their addiction. It has to do coming to a point where they see themselves as changing people, and they're invested in that. Even though it's uncertainty, they don't know what it's going to bring. There's a great deal of enthusiasm, real marker in this stage. It's a rather late stage recovery. And then finally, it sets it up for this, what I'm calling it's not really a last stage, but it's the stage that we recognize that is essentially the most compelling, when all of their previous treatment and life and the experiences from previous stages they've learned from that. And it's years after separation from treatment. It's an evolving stage. The insights and coping strategy of treatment are validated. I want to get to this next slide because there are key markers on this. A change in identity is the distinctive marker of the integration stage. Active addict to recovering addict or non-addict. You know, identity is a label for who I am. You're no longer talking about your behavior, you're talking about who I am. And society labels you and you label yourself. This stage, the identity change, the individual now talks about themselves and labels themselves in a different way. So they may start with that language like active addict. That's a label. That's an identity label. When active addict, it's an identity. But they move from social deviant to conventional person, from a baby to an adolescent to an adult. I had graduates that I interviewed 10 years later. You ask them what happened in treatment, they'll tell you, they won't say that's the place where I cleaned up. They did. They'll often say that's the place where I grew up. And that is they're making the point that so much has changed about themselves that in effect it requires a new label. I'm an adult, I'm no longer a baby, I'm no longer an adolescent. In terms of the real, what have I really learned and how have I grown? Or antisocial or pro-social citizen, those are label identity changes. And the individual, these two checks are very important. They're very important for hiring staff, for example. Individuals are no longer threatened by the people and circumstances associated with their past drug user identity. This is for the great labor force that came out of the recovery movement, early recovery movement, which essentially were the first counselors, essentially, and the first staff in our field. They had gotten very far in their own recovery, so they were already close to this identity stage. One marker for that is they could now relate to other addicts without being threatened any longer. They knew where they were, they knew where the addicts were. Some clients who have not been far enough along in their recovery, who may become staff, and that distance between I and thou may be still too narrow, and they can still be threatened by that. They can relate to active and recovering addicts in the changed role as assistant and helper without questioning and so on. So you can see what this slide is. And the last, I like this because it's an optimistic and real end to this discussion, which is the shift in identity is gradual, since the elements of identity change occur throughout all the stages, it's this point here. This shift in which the individual reframes themselves. Then is who I was, now is who I am. But you notice they're no longer talking about simply their behavior. They're talking about how I have changed. That's identity language. That implies that a lot of things changed that was essentially part of the recovery process of addiction is one. Now, so look, this is a kind of a fast run-through of complex framework. The headline, of course, is if we understand this and can, in a way, kind of buy into it to the extent that you can, it should immediately be adaptable to the whole system's capability of doing assessments. How do we assess recovery? What should be the guideline for assessing it? If you keep leaving that to personal opinion, rather than essentially coming to a uniform position, which could change over time as we get more information in, but here's a framework, here's one framework that would help you do that. And then comes the big question, which is now if we look at our system and all our providers and what they do there, the first thing you're thinking about is how do we now essentially bring this system together to understand which aspects of the systems are most effective with which, if you like, either client and or stage of recovery. So that the issue is to essentially set up a system where each component of that system is capable of identifying where the client is in that stage, has the right set of interventions at that stage to address that stage, and then move the individual to a next stage. And then what happens there, essentially, is the sum total of what happened here, and so then they get something new here. You notice nowhere in this do you see the issue of social services, because these are recovery stages. The use of social services, housing and employment, is misused. You've got to really understand where is the individual in their recovery, so that we can now talk about if they're going to go out on jobs. Watch this. You send people out to work, what work should do, seeking work, first preparing to seek work, then seeking work, then getting work, are all clinical issues. They look like social issues, but they're clinical issues. How the individual prepares to go look for a job, how they get a job if they get a job, how they stay on the job. You have to know what's happening to that client in that first episode of their work experience, because that's a very rich clinical area to work in. So then they should not be out of treatment when they're going to work. You should get the first opportunity to have that client deal with the whole issue of how they work initially. And the same thing in housing. And they're planning housing, who they're planning it with, where they're planning it with, and do they have the resources to pay for it or not, and so on. So what I'm getting at is that it's the whole emphasis on how the individual is changing and not simply what they need in order to, in quotes, maintain their recovery. Of course they need to work. Of course they need housing. They need to reconnect with their relationships. But that's all a matter of preparation through the stages they're in about when they can now constructively do that. So let me stop for the moment. And I realize we ran a little bit over our time, but let's hear from you.